Hello, everyone. I am Pei Ping from UCLA School of Medicine, most importantly, from the Bridge2AI Center, the Skills and Workforce Development core. Together with Dr. Carol Watson, we would like to welcome you to join our very first lecture on the education lecture series that we present to you, to our Bridge2AI community, as well as to many others, either you are in basic science or in clinical science, we welcome you to join us. Our education lecture series consists of 4 different education modules, and Dr. Watson and myself have together jointly organized the very first module, the ethically trustworthy AI education module, as the lecture to launch our curriculum on Bridge2AI methodologies. It is with great honor that we have our first speaker, Dr. Malin, who actually directs the ethics core for the NIH Bridge2AI Center. A brief introduction of Dr. Malin. He's actually one of the most well-known and leading expert in the fields of biomedical ethics, biomedical informatics, statistics, and computer science. He is the Vice Chair for Research Affairs at the Department of Biomedical Informatics, School of Medicine, Vanderbilt University. Throughout his professional career, Dr. Malin has been the one who pioneered different theories, considerations, as well as applications of ethics issues, moving the entire field forward. Please join me to welcome him to give this very first lecture on our ET-AI module. And the title here is a slight different version of what the flyers Dr. Carol Watson and I have sending out. It's recognizing and integrating social good into the AI development life cycle. Today, we're also very fortunate to have both Professor Will Su as well as Professor Wei Wang from UCLA, the Bridge2AI team, to facilitate this lecture. And you can send your questions into the chat box throughout the lecture time. And at the end of the lecture, these questions will be answered and addressed by Professor Malin. Thank you, Brad. Could you start?
It always helps if you take yourself on mute to start. Okay, thank you, Pepe. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of a discussion into how we've gotten to where we are. And so before I do, I did want to give a little bit of context for where I'm coming from. So as was mentioned, so I'm a PI over at the ethics core, but I'm actually only one of the 4 PIs that are part of that core, and I'll introduce you to them later. In addition to that, I'm also running part of the infrastructure core for Aim Ahead, which is one of the other large AI initiatives that the Office of the Director at the NIH has sponsored, and that's going to factor into this talk as we go along. And before all of that, starting about 6-7 years ago, we started a center that was looking at ethical dimensions around the collection and use of genomic and medical records data that the National Human Genome Research Institute provided support for. And so a lot of what you see here today, it really brings together a lot of the work that's happened in these domains. So to kick things off, I wanted to start by talking about a couple of things that I think are on a lot of people's minds, or at least they've heard of them. When you look out into the popular media, you come across these types of stories, right? This one that was published by the Washington Post relatively recently talked about how robots were trained on artificial intelligence, and in doing so, they became racist and sexist. And so notice that they're talking about training of artificial intelligence, right? This is about machine learning. There have been other stories that talk about how AI can acquire biases, again, against race and gender. And then there's also been lots of stories that talk about how computer vision can become racist. And this is a classical study. This one goes back almost 15 years in how Hewlett-Packard had created face recognition and face detection systems and videos, and it could detect it for white people, but it could not detect Black people. What I find really notable about this is that, so this first study that I showed you that was reported in the Washington Post, this happened in 2022. This other story that was reported on in Science, this was 2017. This is 5 years earlier. And then, as I mentioned, the story with HP, this one was specifically published out in 2009, but this technology had been around for quite some time. So why has it that this has become such a hot topic? I think it's because artificial intelligence is starting to really become more deeply ingrained into what we're doing in many different application domains, and biomedicine being one of them. And how we're getting here with respect to machine learning is that we're doing things that, we're running with the machine learning, and we've got tools and technologies for doing things at scale, but we're not necessarily being thoughtful with respect to the way that we're doing things. And the example that I wanted to walk everybody through on this, which I think has relevance to this program, is a study that's become somewhat famous over the last couple of years. And this was a study that Ziad Obermeyer at Berkeley and Sindil Malinahan over at University of Chicago led, where they showed that there was an algorithm that was being used in practice in the clinical setting, and that it appeared to have a racial bias. So what happened? Right? What was the problem? Basically, what they found was that payment levels for the patients were directly correlated with health outcomes, and they found that white patients paid more through insurance. Now, they didn't find this; this just happened to be the case. And so when they went to go build a machine learning model that was going to forecast what types of care somebody should be offered after they left the hospital, it turned out that this was offered more to white people than it was to Blacks. And the main reason why this happened was simply because of the fact that the way that insurance structures worked. And so this really leads you to a teachable moment. It's pretty simple in that one should check for correlations that obscure causality. Right, that in this situation, the model really should have included insurance status before it went out into everyday use. And so this leads you. This is a problem of what I've just shown you to what's referred to as the fairness issue, right? Where we look at an algorithm's performance, and then we tend to stratify it across a couple of different groups of people, and it could be stratified by race, or it could be age, or it could be sexual orientation. And you start measuring how well this algorithm works. And so for one group, it might work relatively well. For the second group, it might not work as well. And then for the third group, you go, yeah, it's not working very well. And at this point, somebody brings up the question: is this unfair? Right? Is the algorithm oriented in a manner that it seems to create a disparity? But the problem is that when you just have a single statistic, a single point estimate, you really can't tell. So what happens is that you start to expand on the statistics, and you move away from the mean estimate, and you start looking at variance. And you say, okay, for one group where it appeared to perform very well, let's say the variance was pretty wide, and then it was still pretty wide for that second group, and it was still wide for that third group. And at this point, you can't make a statistically significant determination as to whether or not this algorithm is unfair in any way. It's not non-determinable. But so you go off and collect more data, right? And you try to bring those variance estimates down. And as you do, that's where confidence starts to set in. And that's the point at which somebody begins to claim, I have sufficient evidence to claim that this is an unfair situation. There's something wrong with your algorithm. Now, there's a lot of software tools that have been developed over the last couple of years to test for this type of algorithmic fairness issue. There's a great study that was published last month by Zhang Bian at University of Florida and Fei Wang over at Cornell, summarizing all of these, as well as the different measures that they use. I'd strongly encourage you to take a look at table 3 in this paper, because I think it will provide some intuition into what you could download and use for yourself when running these assessments. Just to highlight one of them, AI Fairness 360 is a tool that Kush Varney's group over at IBM has developed. And this is a visualization system for not just telling you like whether or not there's bias, but trying to guide you through why this bias has creeped in and how to deal with it. Now, so this brings me back to the question of ethics, because I really haven't brought up the notion of ethics yet, right? And what I've shown you so far is that people are building models, and then they're going off and they're evaluating them, and they're checking to see if these models are fair or not. But this is really only one part of the larger life cycle of where artificial intelligence comes from and where it's heading, right? And before you get to models, you have to ask questions about, well, what's the data? And is the data representative of the population that I'm interested in? And before you even get to the data, you have to ask questions about, well, who is it coming from? And is this data coming from a population that we really have engaged in a manner that allows us to collect the data that we're really interested in? Now, all the while, these evaluations are telling you whether or not what you've done is good and should allow you to move forward. But also it gives you this intuition into whether or not you need to pump the brakes a little bit and take a step back and figure out whether or not you need to redefine how the data is structured, or whether or not you have the right population at hand. Now this is one part of a much bigger life cycle. So this is how you go about making artificial intelligence, right? This is really the research component and the development component. But then you have to flip it around and move this out into the market. This is what we talk about as being the point at which we start using AI. And when you start using AI, there's a whole nother set of questions that come into play. First, there's going to be this question of what exactly are you learning off of these models, and is this information that is meaningful? And then let's say you do have new knowledge that you gain once you've applied this artificial intelligence. Have you produced something that is actionable, or have you just provided just a general observation? And then finally, there's this question about, well, let's say you have a good artificial intelligence model. It has evaluated well within your hospital or within whatever clinical setting you're going to use it in, but now you want to move it over to a different place. You want to move it to a different healthcare facility. And there's a question about whether or not it generalizes and it can be used at another institution without it failing. So this is what people have generally come to refer to as the ethics of artificial intelligence in a general sense. And I think this is useful, but at the same time, I feel as though the focus has become on this perspective that ethics is this really heavy issue that it kind of obscures what it is that we're trying to do with AI. And I think that when you start to dig into this, and I paraphrase Ellen Wright Clayton, one of the co-PIs for the ethics core, the ethics is there to help you concretize the goals of what you're trying to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it's there to give you some intuition into what the pitfalls could be along the way. And at the same time, you can use this as the basis for, well, what is it that you're trying to achieve? What is the way that you are heading down? And the way that the computer science community has started to think about this is that, well, we're trying to achieve some type of a social good. And so there's a reframing that's been taking place in the community of, yes, we want to think about the ethical dimensions, but there is this anticipation that whatever we do, we want to orient the technology to have some type of a benefit for the populations in which it's going to be used with. So this life cycle that I've articulated here, and fully recognize that this is one view on this life cycle. There's probably many pieces that are missing, but I think it gives some intuition into how this functions. Where things can break down is you can imagine that when you're working with populations and you're working with people to gather data, if you don't interact with them in an appropriate manner, what will end up happening is you lead to a failure of trust. And when trust breaks down with people, you basically have lost your ability to gather data or use data. You can also look at, there's this question of, is the data even representative? If you're trying to study things in a more general sense, if you don't have a population that's represented appropriately, then the models that you develop right out of the gate, they're already shot, right? If you are trying to learn something that is going to be useful across multiple populations, but one of the populations isn't even there, then you have a problem with your data. And that can't be corrected in an algorithmic bias assessment because they were never even at the table for that assessment. But then that, I brought out the point of, algorithmic bias can creep in. I think that that's a more technical issue. I've already shown you how that can come into play, but clearly this is where a lot of trust in the model falls apart. And then there's questions about, when you start using AI, what can go wrong? So if you generate knowledge, but the people who are going to gather that knowledge and potentially act upon it can't understand what it is, and it's unexplainable, at that point, that there's a loss of faith at that point. And so this is where a lot of research in explainability and interpretability of AI has really focused. And then there's questions about, like, well, can you even use this? So for instance, if you have an AI technology and it's going to predict whether or not somebody's going to be readmitted to the hospital, for instance, and it doesn't tell you what you can do to stop that readmission, then it's it's an unusable piece of technology. It's providing you with information, but it's not necessarily providing you with something that you can do with it. And then I've mentioned the generalizability problem, and that this is what happens if you have a loss of context, right? Where if you try to move an AI from an inner city hospital out to a more rural environment, you're not necessarily representing the context in a manner that provides a warranty that the AI is trained for that type of a setting. Now, I wanted to give a couple of other cases to give some intuition into how these things not just could go wrong, but how they have gone wrong, and that there's lessons to be learned from things that we've seen in the past, so that we don't repeat these problems. And a really great example of this is what happened with the Havasupai tribe. And the way I refer to this problem is, simply because data exists, it doesn't mean that you can use it for anything that you want. And so this is a study that came out in JAMA about a decade ago. And the problem was that you had data that was collected from this tribe by researchers at the University of Arizona, and it was consented, but was consented for a certain purpose. And the data ended up being reused by people at the university for purposes that went above and beyond the scope of consent. And you can ask, like, how did this happen? And this was really an issue of the provenance associated with this data was not clearly documented. And so there was an expectation that, well, the data was already on the shelf, so certainly we can use this. And so this is a situation in which, yeah, you end up on the front page of the New York Times. So this tribe brought back suit against the University of Arizona, and they were successful in their suit. And so there's a very clear teachable moment here, which is that the data are from people, right? They're from communities that have certain cultures, and this needs to be acknowledged. And that data should not be used in a manner that's disrespectful to the expectations of that population. But this only comes out when you have clear documentation of what those were. And if that population is no longer at the table after the data has been collected, you lose the ability to reinforce that type of an expectation. Now, this was one example, but you can see how this has played out more recently in similar types of situations where you have cases where data is just picked up and reused without even people knowing it. So there's this great story that Casey Ross reported on at Stat earlier this year, where he was talking about IBM's market scan system, which is a large collection of really vast amounts of claims data on, as you can see here, on over 270 million Americans that is just commercialized by IBM without the knowledge of the individuals to whom this data corresponds. Now, the data is de-identified, and we'll come back to this in a second, but this doesn't really change the fact that there's this question of, is there an expectation of how this data is going to be applied? And in this situation, this is clearly something that is deviating from expectation. A couple of years ago, there was also this case that brought to light the relationships between companies that are gathering data in the context of business operations. So Google entered into a relationship with Ascension Health to develop services that were AI driven to provide everything from scheduling and recommendations for patients with respect to their health. But there were these questions about, why was Google being provided with fully identified medical records to develop this technology, as well as fully identified information on the care providers who were providing that care? There were arguments that Google was providing this service under a business associate agreement to Ascension Health. But there was a whistleblower within Google that said, something seems to be off here, and the artifact of this was that Congress began an investigation into these practices. But then that was in November of 2019, and by early 2020, we had this little thing called a pandemic that had began, and as a result, this kind of fell. I wouldn't say fell to the wayside. It was just, it didn't receive as much attention. A different way, we're starting to think about the broader life cycle here. This notion of context, I think, is really exemplified by a story that was reported on last year. They're talking about how Epic, the EHR system developer, they trained a machine learning model to predict sepsis. And they then made this technology available to anybody who was using Epic's EHR. But the issue is that they trained it on a very specific population's data. And then that model was reused with a new population and several new populations, and it was reported that the performance was substantially weakened. And that didn't seem to be in accordance with what Epic had claimed it was supposed to be. So again, this ends up being a teachable moment. As I get to it, I want to point out once again, you have the news story that gets written about this, and these are going to show up over and over again. Casey Ross just happens to be writing a lot of these of late, but it's pretty clear that this comes back to the context issue, which is that you move a model, or you move machine learned models from one location to another, and you haven't verified it or validated it on the population that you're going to use it with, then you're somewhat flying blind, and there's no expectation or even guarantee. There's no guarantee that it's going to work as you expected. Now, so what I've shown you is that this is a matter of you have to make investments. So as you are building machine learning, it costs money to gather information, to bring the computation to the table, to train the systems that are going to be building the models. And so there are questions about how you're going to allocate funds when doing so, and how do you guarantee that there's fairness with respect to these systems. At the same time, these investments are going to be made in computation, but there's also going to be questions about who are the people that you're training to perform these actions. Are you going to be democratizing the notion of artificial intelligence, or are we going to be training or not just providing the data back to the companies and to the places that have been the most capable of doing this from the outset? An example of how to start making some type of a change, I believe, is what we've done over at the All of Us program, which I've been helping run privacy for the last couple of years. So this is an environment that we've worked to try to make a more publicly accessible and reusable, as well as service training environments. For those that aren't familiar with all of us, this is a very large program that the NIH has made investments in to collect medical records and biospecimens from over 1 million individuals in the United States, so that it can be reused for research purposes. So I would say that this is one of those special cases of a public data generation project. And so for those that are interested in taking a look at how this was architected, you can follow this link to the data browser that we've created that provides you with intuition into the types of information that we've collected on these participants. And it includes information from people's medical records, as well as survey data, and we've recently released genomic data on 100,000 individuals. The point I want to make here is that this is a consented cohort. So this is a population of people who have been brought in, and there's been a series of consentings. So they do understand to a certain degree what it is that they've become involved with. For those that want to gain a little bit more intuition into this, on the left, what you see is this is just the general set of diagnoses that exist within the population, and you can see that pain ends up being the highest frequency, followed by more general metabolic issues. Right, but you can condition your analysis as well. And so what I'm showing on the right is what happens if you just do a quick search for cancer, and you can see that malignant neoplasms ends up showing up as the most popular or the most frequent event here. But you can see that breast cancer is number 4. This is an environment in which where the democratization takes place is that all the data has been moved into an environment where people can build Jupyter notebooks without having to download the data into their own domain. And so the technology is at their disposal at this point with elastic compute. I'm not going to go through the details of how, what a Jupyter notebook looks like. For those of you that are familiar, I think you can imagine it. So what I do want to point out, though, is that we didn't choose a one-size-fits-all model for access to information, and the tiers we created 3 tiers. One was that public view that I just showed you that you can get access to without really digging into the details of the records. But then there are 2 sandbox environments, and as I mentioned, this is Jupyter sitting on top of Terra, on top of GCP. And the first environment is what's referred to as the registered tier, where people in academic and organizations who have entered into an agreement with all of us, they provision access, or anybody within these institutions can have access to the data. We're considering this like a beta testing environment because the plan is to move this out to citizen scientists and other organizations beyond academia over time. But this is an environment where we're providing individual level participant data that we've assessed to show that it has a low risk of re-identification. What we released earlier this year is the controlled tier, which is where we put whole genome sequencing for about 100,000 individuals, and there's a little bit more detail with respect to the demographics of them, but it's still designated as a non-human subjects environment by the NIH's IRB. But as I mentioned, this can be used as a catalyst for training activities and diversification of the workforce, so that it's not just being used by the same set of investigators over time. And so all of us has made an investment in bringing together people from HBCUs and minority serving institutions, so that they can take part in getting trained as well as just using this resource. And there's subsidies that are provided for the computation as well. There's similar types of activities over at AIMAHead. AIMAHead recently announced the initiation of around 20 different research pilots that are at institutions across the country. We've also started a research fellows program that's bringing forward postdocs and early career professionals within biomedicine to get trained in machine learning. And then we've also initiated a leadership training program so that people who are not necessarily going to be the builders of the machine learning technology, but are going to have to figure out how to make investments and use it. How do they gain the competency that's necessary for decision making? So this is about, there's this notion of learning, right? We're trying to set up a learning environment. And so we really are kind of hitting a new frontier. And so as we're doing this, we're trying to understand how is it that the dynamic is changing. And so one of the things that we're doing over in AIM-AHEAD is that we're bringing ethnographers into the environment so that they can work with researchers and research teams. And so that they can gain intuition into like, so how do they go about gathering data? How do they go about interacting with populations? How do you work with an IRB or administrative leadership to get such projects up and running? Because these are not all necessarily using systems like all of us. Some of these are local computing, some of these are other types of their own cloud computing environments. And so there's lots of questions of how did these environments come to be? Same issue with respect to how do you get access to data and not just access to the infrastructure, but how do you make these things interact with one another? And then once you've observed this, you can begin to complete your needs assessment and run the gap analysis to figure out like, are you supporting the environment where there's an opportunity for meaningful artificial intelligence development as well as its implementation. So what I've talked about is how do you create these environments? But the question is, what do you want to get out of these environments? And this is where people tend to talk about the new R's. And these are all about what are your teams and your experimental environments achieving? And the first R is this notion of repeatability. You want to have the same team, have the same experimental setup, and show that they can run it multiple times, right? Get the same result with the same data. Once you take a step beyond repeatability, you want to get to replicability, which is that you want to get the same experimental setup moved over to a different team so that you can transfer the knowledge or the capabilities away from that initial team over to another team so that they can start learning how to do work. And then eventually you can get to the notion of reproducibility, where you have different experimental setups, different teams, and this is about achieving generalizable knowledge. I can show that I can get to the same result with different data or different environments and different teams. There's a push towards doing this, not just in research, but also because a lot of the journals are starting to request this. So PLOS is a great example where they've moved in this direction of requiring authors to make all necessary data necessarily available to replicate what they've published, right? That's been the push, and some of this is an artifact of irreproducible research. And so this push has taken place within. There's been various repositories created. So like Dryad is one. ICPSR over at Michigan, where they're trying to create environments where data can be made publicly accessible. The NIH has also made these investments, and there's this push towards scientific data sharing. A lot of you are probably familiar with the new data sharing requirements that are going to be going into effect early next year. But there is still like a pushback here, and for good reason. There are questions about to what extent can all data be legally shared or provided out into the public domain without infringing upon the ethical aspects of how it was collected or the well-being of the populations. And one of the biggest pushbacks has been this notion of privacy. And so this is a problem that persists in human subjects research and data that is derived from the clinical setting more generally. This is not a new problem, but it's one that is really beginning to butt heads with this notion of open science. Now there's been lots of ways to try to address this problem. There's been numerous variations on de-identification, but ensuring that these are actually applied in practice, that's a much more tricky thing to bring to the table. There's a lot of challenges here. So I would say, like, de-identification can be your friend. things that we've done in All of Us and in other settings. Like there's ways to be pragmatic about this, and one of the ways in which this is typically done is try to get some type of a characterization of how is information actually going to be infringed upon with respect to privacy. So I think it's pretty obvious to acknowledge or to recognize when you're in a high risk situation that you don't want to share an individual's social security number or their name. But then there's these other questions about like what happens when you've got something that's potentially going to identify someone, where you have their age, their gender, maybe the place of service, and these are things that need to be thought through a little bit more. Like obviously the high risk ones needs to be they need to be changed or brought off the table. And then you have the low risk ones where they probably don't need any type of assessment, but people need to still sign off on this, right? So like the copay that the individual was susceptible that they needed to pay when they were at the hospital. This is not something that's necessarily publicly accessible and could readily be used for identification purposes. But what I'm talking about here is this is about understanding adversarial capabilities. And in order to make the identification or any variation of data sharing work, you really have to have an understanding of where you're sharing it to. And this is why public data sharing is so challenging, because you really don't have an idea of who people are when you make data accessible in an environment that you don't have control over. So one of the big things that people talk about is identifiability. And when they talk about identifiability, you get to those moderate types of risk things, those things that those what people refer to as quasi-identifiers, and you look at how could they be exploited, and what people look at is they look at the uniqueness of them, the extent to which they're replicable in various resources, and the extent to which people can gain access to those resources. And I would argue that this is actually only one piece of this data protection puzzle. And that what it's doing is it's saying what's the chance that information would be re-identified if you don't control them at all, if you don't control the users. And we should really acknowledge the fact that we are putting other types of deterrents in place, or we could do so. And these could be use agreements, or they could be hosted environments like what we've done in All of Us, where we tie unique logins to people's use of the resource and have the opportunity to audit them. We might serve in deterrence by putting a small pay for access, so that the data is not always readily accessible at any moment in time. There's lots of strategies that could be applied, but the point I'm trying to make here is that we're not in a situation where we necessarily have to provide all information to the world simultaneously. And so this is the bigger picture is that it's a layered approach to privacy. Okay. At the same time, this notion of de-identification, it does have some concerns associated with it. So it typically works in that it will amend or it will hide some features that are going to be leveraged to identify an individual. And I was talking about individual level data sharing, but the same is true if you're going to do some type of a federated learning, or you're going to be sharing information in an aggregated manner. You're obscuring what happens at the individual level. So the thing, though, that happens is that when you have smaller populations, when you're trying to accomplish some type of a de-identification, the smaller the population, the greater the chance that you're going to end up amending that population. And so if you have like a small geographic area, or you only have a couple of individuals who associate with a particular sexual orientation, chances are that information is going to be amended in a manner that is more heavy than on the majority populations. And so this can have further implications on the bias that exists within the data and the generalizability of anything that you learn off that data. So you end up with this competing goal of where is the appropriate sweet spot between privacy and utility. One of the other emerging challenges that we're running into is that with the rise of social media, we've seen a lot more self-disclosure. And so a lot of the identifiability assessments tend to work under the belief that people don't necessarily tell you things about them as they would things that might be revealed within the course of the study. But in a study that we had published a couple of years ago, we found people self-disclosing in All of Us. We found people self-disclosing in UK Biobank, the Framingham Heart Study. I believe in about 70 different studies, we found self-disclosures. And so this makes it really challenging for providing guarantees of what you're promising them. Now, moreover, we also saw that this disclosure was not always by the individual themselves. Sometimes the research program had worked with individuals who might be participant ambassadors and said, you know, it would be great if you could tell the world why you wanted to become a part of this study, so that you can encourage other people to become a part of it, which again, it erodes some of our capability for protection. And so this begs questions over what are the obligations of protection for the organizations that are trying to generate or share this data. One more point that I wanted to make, and then I'll close this up, is that there's been a lot of research over the last couple of years on this notion of synthetic data. And on one side, people have argued, you know, synthetic data is like what you do to protect privacy. But there's been a lot of research to show that synthetic data is useful for what you refer to as augmentation, in that when you have populations that don't have much data, you might be able to generate records to boost up the representation within a data set so that you can learn in a more balanced fashion. And so this has been a somewhat strong push over the last couple of years. It's not a new principle. You know, the first paper in this for medical records data, we published on this about 5 years ago, where we did demonstrations with data from Sutter Health and the MIMIC program, where we were looking at to what extent could we generate records that had the demographic diagnostic look and feel of those records. And this is your typical my line better than your line graph, but what we showed was that there's a good chance that under the right circumstances you can generate synthetic data that's useful. And so then these technologies have evolved, and so we've shown how to create better training and evaluation methods, how to embed constraints into these learning frameworks, because they're all artificially intelligence driven. So, you know, you don't really want to generate a data set that has a lot of women with prostate cancer. It's just not something that you would expect to see. And then we've shown how to move from static to longitudinal data simulations so that you can look at systems over time. And we originally developed this for all of us so that our software engineers could do system testing, but we're in the midst of making 2 data sets that are going to be publicly accessible from the system later this year or early next year as we get approvals. One will be focused on type 2 diabetics and one will be focused on breast cancer patients. I'll skip this part. Now, I would say, though, that synthetic data is not perfect, and there are still things that can go wrong. So you can't just take this off the shelf and reapply it. The best example of this is a recent study that showed this notion of how the fake information can end up having highly similar properties, which is what you want. You want an aggregate, you want there to be highly similar properties, but it turns out that if you don't train appropriately, you'll end up with things that get close to mimicking the original data. And so this is where machine learning can go boink, right? So you could have mimicry. You could have intrusions that are referred to as membership inference, where somebody can test if somebody is potentially in the training data set. Now, this does require having some prior knowledge about certain things about these individuals, but it's been shown that it's plausible. And then there's potential problems for further inference about things that you might not have known about somebody from the outset. You're using that model for prediction, which is what the data was designed to support. But when you combine membership and attribute disclosure, when I show somebody's in the data set and then I learn something new about them, this is where the real disclosure occurs. So the final aspect of this is that you always have to ensure that this data has some type of biomedical face value. And this takes way more time than evaluating just statistical viability. This requires trying to sit down and work with clinically knowledgeable experts. And so while the AI is getting better, there's a lot of medicine that requires human intuition, and you're going to have to work with humans to get them into the loop to work on a refinement of these technologies so that they don't get blinded by what's in the data itself. This is what I refer to as the open world problem. Until you have complete perfect representation in silico or in a digital form. There's always going to need to be some type of human interpretation. So a couple parting thoughts. I think that the notion of what people are referring to ethics or as social good in the context of artificial intelligence, they're extremely complex. We do not know what all of them are at the moment. I think some of the people who are sitting on this Zoom who are working in the ethics modules of the data generation projects for Bridge are going to be exploring new lines of inquiry that we never would have anticipated a year ago, probably not even anticipating 1 year from now. These problems are going to take a long time to address. I don't think that we're going to necessarily have solutions right out of the gate. And I think that there's going to require a lot of multidisciplinary collaboration in order to have an understanding of how to address these things in practice. One thing that I would highlight, though, is that we cannot wait until artificial intelligence is completely at the table before the ethical issues are addressed. We have to hypothesize, we have to have some type of support for the what ifs. We need to anticipate what could happen. Otherwise, we'll be left in the cold. And in doing so, what that means is that you really are going to need to engage people who wouldn't necessarily be at the table when having ethical discussions. You need to make sure that you're talking with the scientists, that you're talking with the populations that the data is going, or the models are going to be associated with. And you have to talk with people like who are regulators and eventually the ones that are going to make determinations over what is an appropriate safety level for these technologies. So that's going to require education, and it's going to require a lot of evaluation as we move forward. It's not going to be just armchair philosophizing. Final point is that this is a story that came out a couple weeks ago that we have to be really careful. Like this notion of saying that we want responsible or ethical AI, we do want to do this, but it shouldn't be that there's like one single policing authority. If you do this, if it's just one group that is tasked with doing this, then you end up in a situation where people will just, their brain will explode. They will just lose the ability and the focus of what they're trying to do. And so we need to figure out a way of embedding the belief structure of how do you go about building these types of technologies in an ethically viable manner. So I'm going to give a lot of acknowledgements because the people that we work with are all over the place. The Bridge core itself includes Vanderbilt, people from the University of Texas Health Sciences Center, UCSD, the Broad Institute, and then there's going to be many more people involved in this as we move forward. There's just too many people to name. And with that, I will open the floor to questions.
Fantastic, Brad. It's so educational and insightful. We have actually quite a few questions already in the chat box coming from our audience. Can you see them, Brad, or I can relay them?
Yeah, I can. I'm happy to facilitate this.
That would be great. Well,
yeah, no problem. So thanks so much again, Brad. So the first question that we have in the chat box from one of the attendees, I thought was a very good one in the sense that, so can you talk about the tension and perhaps the inherent conflict with key ethical aspects of the recently issued OSTP Blueprints for AI Bill of Rights? And so for those of you who don't know that acronym, it's the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, with key aspects of large scale NIH projects such as all of us, as well as Bridge2AI, and how this tension might be responsibly resolved. And so the questioner had two specific aspects that they wanted to highlight. One was the blueprint calls for data minimalism, and also number two, specific consent for each use or purpose, whereas biomedical initiatives seem to continue to push for broad general consents and extensive generation and aggregation of that data?
That's a great question. It's also got about 10 questions embedded in it. There's a lot of other issues associated with the Bill of Rights that was brought forward. One of the big challenges is that the Bill of Rights really talks about what will happen with data that's collected by the federal government, and not so much about how corporations are going to be expected to control and use data. To follow up on this specific aspect of the question, first, let's look at the notion of consent. I can bring this back to how all of us has addressed this. We worked under broad consent, and the main reason was because we did not know what the data was going to be used for, and nor did we think that we were going to be able to provide specific oversight and review for every use of the data. In that context, particularly, it was considered, as I've mentioned before, it was non-human subjects. And so therefore it was not something that required an IRB to provide an approval for every single time somebody was going to request access to it. Instead we adopted what we call the passport model, where we provide a review of who the investigator is that's coming in through the front door, but then we didn't want to slow down their scientific inquiry. And so if they wanted to shift from looking at hypertension within one particular subpopulation into another subpopulation, we didn't think that that was going to be a full review. That said, one of the things that we did do was we do require all of the users of that resource, all the workspaces, to have a public, layman's readable version of what it is that they're doing within that space. It's not a review. We did this in order to be consistent with the 21st Century Cures Act, so that people would say, I'm doing scientific inquiry, here is what I'm doing. But it's not something that you would say, you need to stop this and go under review. There just needs to be an acknowledgement that there's an opportunity for investigation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to potentially misuse a resource. And that's a question that I think that we don't know exactly how we're going to address these yet, because we haven't really seen any situation, at least in all of us, where somebody has misused that resource. And so the types of penalties that are going to be invoked are probably going to be proportional to the intrusions that end up occurring. So I think there is going to be, however, a big tension between this notion of artificial intelligence versus minimalism. So let's shift the perspective there. The main reason is that the whole point of machine learning is that you're trying to learn relationships between variables to explain some type of an outcome that we don't know how to do now. If we knew how to do it, then we would have already told you what variables you needed to have, and the models would have already been created. The fact that people are trying to learn, it's kind of a cyclical exploratory process. You're going to bring in a bunch of variables. You're going to try and hypothesize or generate, I guess you could call it hypothesis generation, of the variables that might be appropriate. They're not necessarily causal, right? Machine learning isn't always causal. We're not always talking about causal influence. So you might be looking at proxy variables. And so even learning what those proxy variables are might be useful to try to figure out what additional variables you would use to try to explain why they were actually meaningful, or I shouldn't say meaningful, just correlative. So I think there's going to be a huge tension with minimalism, mainly because it's going to be almost impossible for people to say, these are the things I need to have access to. If you talk to a machine learner, myself included, and you ask somebody, what variables do you need to run your investigation? Usually what you're going to say is, what variables can you give me? And you want to give me like 200,000 variables? Yeah, the system's going to be overrepresented at that point, but I'm going to try and figure out what's the right type of dimensionality reduction strategy and set of features that might be appropriate at that time. If you do it a priori, it's going to be, again, that's probably going to be hypothesis limiting. So it's going to be a huge tension. I don't know if we know how exactly this is going to play out over the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I do want to be, mindful that there's a lot of questions coming in. So it's a really, thought-provoking talk. One other question I'll ask is, can you comment on how some of the ethical issues you highlighted apply to acquisition of data from children? And knowing that this is a bit open-ended, but it's really interesting to see kind of, are there particular issues in AI and medicine that those of us working in pediatrics need to consider?
Yeah, so I'm going to say two things here. One, I'm going to say I'm not the expert on this issue, and this is where I would usually look at Ellen Clayton and say this seems to be right within your space. That said, since I'm on the hot seat for this, what I would say is that with children, you have a really challenging problem on your hands because you have to deal with parental consent, or you have to deal with a situation where people are providing consent on somebody else's behalf. And then you also have to wrestle with the fact of what happens when they want to step out of the system once they turn 18. But I don't think that this is unique unto artificial intelligence at all. And so I would say that a lot of what we've learned in other environments is probably going to be very applicable here. But that's where I say I'm not the expert on this topic.
Great, thanks. Another question is, what are your thoughts on addressing how our models amplify bias markers? An example here is many algorithms are likely to find a link between bad health outcomes and membership in disadvantaged communities, when in fact it's just showing that those communities are disadvantaged.
Yeah, so this is a really hard one. This is where you require further inquiry. And there's got to be a collection of additional variables that could potentially be used to explain why there's a correlation between a variable and the outcome. I also argue for why a lot of what we're doing in machine learning, where we're taking the kitchen sink approach of just throw every variable in as a dependent variable and see how that as an independent variable, and then check to see how that influences the dependent variable is a really dangerous precedent. Because it suggests A, that you understand what all the variables are that you need, and B, it says that when I've got a correlation, that correlation is a marker. But in reality, you need to take a step back and say, why is that happening? You need to go back towards causal modeling, and you might need to go off and either go back to the populations that the study was done with initially, collect additional information with them, or do another study with an additional set of variables so that you can try and see you just need to figure out if there's causality. Amplification is going to be a problem if we don't stop and take a step back and come up with a grounded theory for why things are happening. That's probably one of the biggest challenges that we're going to continue to face.
Great. And so I think for the time that we have, we'll take one more question. So this question is, one of the slides show a news article about the native tribe fighting to limit research on their DNA. And this raises the question about fear of harms that can be done on a population level from research and not just individual. How can this data sharing model go beyond preventing the identification of the individual to prevent harms at a population level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there's a question about there's a difference between the legal norm, the legal requirement, and ethical norms, and a lot of this is an artifact of the way that the law is written, and the law talks about how you protect information when it's going to be uniquely identifying to an individual. The notion of group-based harms and group-based implications, this isn't really addressed so much in the way the law currently works. And I think that that's an opportunity for further either legal or regulatory investigation and potentially a reconsideration of what it is that we consider requires protection. If you go that route, it would have implications with respect to HIPAA. It would have implications with respect to the common rule. Does it mean you shouldn't go down that line of inquiry? Definitely not, but it's going to require further clarification of who it is and how it is that you're protecting them. So like the definition of a group or a community this is extremely challenging to define. I think in tribal nations, it's a lot easier because we have a very clear demarcation and a legal standing for a particular group. When you start to talk about other groups in the US, you could say, how far am I allowed to slice and dice this? Like, would I say that a gay population in San Francisco that is between the age group of 18 to 24 is a community? You know, is that its own group? Could you like move that over into like the DC area, and is that a different group? You know, so there's going to have to be all sorts of questions about what ends up being a community definition in this situation.
Great. Well, I think we're up at time for the webinar. So thank you so much, Brad, for giving such a thought-provoking talk and for also your wonderful answers. I don't know if Pepe or Carol, if you guys wanted to make some closing comments.
Carol, to you first. Hi, Carol, you may be muted. See if Carol can get the microphone issue sorted. And Brett, thank you so much again. And I think the lectures equally as well as all the questions and your answers have stimulated our further thinking in this direction. And we really, truly appreciate all your insights. And this is quite an education experience. We will be sharing your talk with the Bridge2AI community, and let us know, Brett, if you have any questions for us or for the audience before we conclude this wonderful event.
No, this is a wonderful event. Thanks for the invite.
And thanks for being our first speaker.
Yes.